It's my pleasure to moderate this session, where I will now no longer need a microphone, on emerging Arab views of Israel and of the region more generally. One of the trends that I think has caught the attention of analysts and observers of the Middle East is a decreasing hostility, perhaps, toward Israel among certain circles in the Arab world. Now, for all of that, when we tried to reach out to Arab analysts and policy practitioners to invite them here to join us for this panel, we had difficulty still bringing people here. So we decided to take a different tack and reach out to some of the leading foreign policy practitioners in the Arab world and get their views, get their assessment on evolving views of Israel in the region and of some other key topics today. So it's a privilege to be here with Ambassador Barbara Leaf and Ambassador Dana Schell-Smith. I will introduce them briefly. Ambassador Barbara Leaf to my left is the Ruth and Sid Lapidus Fellow and Director of the Geduld Program on Arab Politics at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She's a distinguished Foreign Service officer. Her last posting before retiring a couple of years ago was as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Arab Emirates from 2014 to 2018. She also served in Cairo, Jerusalem, Tunis, Basra, and spent many years working on Iran, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula. Ambassador Dana Schell-Smith is a career Foreign Service officer. She served most recently as the U.S. Ambassador to Qatar from 2014 to 2017, and previously she was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, Regional Arabic Spokesperson, and she worked at embassies and offices in Egypt, Gaza, Jordan, and here in Israel. So thank you both for being with us here. So I'm going to start with a topic that hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the last day and a half, and that is the Trump proposal. The administration did a remarkable job of keeping the details of this plan secret for the last couple of years. But one of the running themes throughout the process that the administration undertook was this idea that they were going to reach out and get some buy-in from Arab states in whatever eventual proposal they were going to put on the table. The implication being that if they garnered enough support, I suppose, from the Arab world writ large, it could potentially spur the Palestinians to move in the direction of an agreement. So my first question for you both is, I wonder if you could assess what the Arab reaction has been to this proposal. We saw when it was announced, the ambassadors of Oman and Bahrain and the UAE were there in the room. But more generally, if you could just offer some initial assessments of what the Arab world thinks of what has happened in the last 2 days.
So I think on the one hand, as we've discussed over a couple of days here, the striking thing was who was not there. Egypt and Jordan, and of course Saudi Arabia, but Egypt and Jordan not being there as the two states that have formal relationships with Israel longstanding, their absence was striking, although they provided measured statements like the other governments welcoming the efforts of the administration. I stress the efforts because I think it's a stretch to say there was endorsement, there was a welcoming of the plan itself, and then it appears to have dropped like a stone in terms of wider reaction.
Yeah, I would agree with Barbara. I think the other things that I would add to that are that from my perspective, I think the fact that it dropped like a stone probably signifies more that there are other concerns consuming many of the Arab governments in the region more than the Israel-Palestinian problem, which is, of course, a new development. So I think the analysts paying attention to that are right. You know, I know places where I've worked, people are extremely concerned about Iran, share the threat of Hezbollah with Israel, you know, are much more concerned about things closer to home, frankly.
And I will come back to something that Ambassador Smith has pointed out. This is a reflection of shifts in the region, for sure. I mean, 15, 20 years ago, you could expect all sorts of governments to mobilize their populations against it, or to allow the populations free rein to demonstrate and so forth. I'm not saying those days are past. They're not, and I think we'll get into the discussion of where the publics are on the issue of Israel and normalization, but definitely we're in a changing landscape in which people are terribly preoccupied with domestic challenges as well as external challenges.
So one thing that struck me, אגב, אין לנו טיימר פה, אז אני אשמח להמשיך עד סוף היום, אבל רק שתדעו. Okay. So one of the things that was striking was, first of all, I think you did see an attempt on the part of most of these Arab governments to acknowledge the efforts, as Ambassador Leaf, you said, the efforts of the administration. I think they were careful to be positive in their assessment of President Trump, but at the same time reserve their comments on the substance of the plan, and essentially issue statements that are have been familiar to most of us for years, that the parties will need to work out the details, which was an interesting lesson perhaps that no government, I think, wants to run afoul of the Trump administration. But the other thing that was interesting was, and I'm curious if you would want to comment on this, the differences in some of the Arab reactions. So the rift between perhaps the Qatar camp, along with non-Arab states like Turkey, but their reaction to this was quite different from what we saw coming out of Abu Dhabi and perhaps others. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. You want to go first to me? Go ahead.
Ambassador Smith, why don't you start?
Well, since I served most recently in Qatar, and they tend to be the outliers on these things, I'll take that one first. I think, you know, of course, Qatar plays a role here in helping to manage the problems with Hamas, which I'm sure you're going to ask me about at some point, so I won't take that on. But I think they would have a very hard time being in the room for that purpose. They have a close relationship to the Palestinians, both in the West Bank and Gaza, and I think their statement included the line that an agreement should include the 1967 borders. So, but what I know of their leadership there is that if there were an agreement that all the parties were happy with, or at least were signing on to, I don't think they would have included a line like that. I think their reaction had much more to do with the fact that they did not see the Palestinian side being consulted along the years by our administration.
And I would add that in a number of statements by Jordan, by Egypt, by follow-up commentary about Bahrain, by Kuwait, and by Saudi Arabia, you had reflections in Saudi Arabia's case that eternal reference to the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which of course has a more expansive vision of the vision than was reflected in the Trump vision. And in all those other cases, they referred to the 67 borders and so forth, and justice and so forth. So I think you're right. People wanted to be very careful for their individual bilateral reasons not to run afoul of this president. But on the other hand, not full-throated endorsement of the substance.
So before I leave this topic, I'll just note that I think there is going to be an Arab League summit, a meeting this Saturday, right? And so I think it'll be something to look for in terms of more formal reactions coming out of the Arab states. Any predictions on that?
Well, if you've got everybody there, you've got Iraq, you've got Algeria, you've got a mix of countries, and I would suspect there's going to be a tendency to shift back to something that is more classic language that we've heard for decades. But again, the important thing that has shifted is you're not seeing governments mobilize the populations against the US, Israel, against this as such. So that does reflect something.
And no one wants to be the next leader tweeted about by Trump. So I think it will probably be a very measured statement that tries not to offend anyone.
Okay, so I want to zoom out now a little bit and talk about what you both observed in your time, both actually serving in some of these countries and also since. I mean, I should say that the ambassadors are no longer serving in government, but they have maintained very close ties, and you're both traveling back and forth a lot still to these countries. So if you could say something about the evolving views, both of the region. So for example, Ambassador Smith, you last served in Doha. I mean, how does Doha, when it looks around the region, what are the main threats it sees, what are the opportunities it views, and where does Israel come into any of this? And then Ambassador Leaf, I'll turn to you and ask for comments.
Don't say Abu Dhabi is the main threat.
Abu Dhabi is the main threat. I do think the fact that Qatar is under blockade by its neighbors has to be the top priority and top challenge that it faces. It has the only airspace that its airline can fly out of Qatar is over Iran, which of course makes them subject to pressure from Iran if Iran chooses to use it. So I think their first challenge, the thing that most Qataris, not just the government, but friends, people that I speak to are consumed by, is the blockade. And their very precarious spot in the region. Even when they're not under blockade, they feel themselves to be sort of trapped between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which explains a lot about their relationship with Turkey, which I know people here are thinking about quite a bit. So when they look across the region, I hear young Qataris talking about the innovation coming out of Israel and talking about Israeli startups. I hear investors talk about either investments they are already making or investments they would like to be making, whether together with Israelis or in Israeli companies. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture. The people in the streets aren't running around saying, let's, do all of our investments in Israel. But I think people have started to think about challenges, being closer to home, and looking at Israel as an opportunity when you talk about something other than politics. The politics are obviously very complicated.
So I want to push you on this point, if I may, because I think here in Israel, and not just here in Israel, but there is this perception of Qatar as being a leader in the camp of supporters of Islamist movements around the region, the Muslim Brotherhood and derivative groups. Closer to home here, Qatar's involvement with Hamas right next door is very contentious and I think viewed as a form of hostility to some extent. So how can we reconcile that perception with this idea that now you've presented of actually Qataris being perhaps open to some measure of ties with Israelis? How should we make sense of this?
So I think all countries want to survive. That's their first priority. And I always, when I'm talking to Americans, I always talk about the challenge of being a tiny country, which I know people in Israel would understand more. And the challenge of how do you survive as an independent, tiny Arab country in the Gulf when you're surrounded by much larger, much more populous, much stronger countries, wealthier, stronger militaries. There are 250,000 Qataris in total on Earth, which is just stunning. I mean, that's smaller than the workforce of a Fortune 500 company. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's just incredible. So their view of these groups and the reason that they do support so many groups that we wish they would not is because the thing they are most afraid of is the organized political Islam threatening them. So, and I know Ambassador Leaf will talk about the very different view from where she served, but when you talk to a Qatari, they talk about how the worst thing that happened to the region was Egypt pushing the Muslim Brotherhood out in the 80s, because they saw all of those people go to Afghanistan, become radicalized, become jihadis, and multiply and come back out. And so their feeling is, if political Islam is going to be the way that some of these people are going to organize themselves, let's get it out in the open. Let's make sure we don't allow violence. We know who these people are, and that that they're accountable in a system and to a society. Now, we've seen the way the Qataris do this is not always successful. And like I say, both of our governments, the United States and Israel, have had a number of problems with some of the groups that they have chosen to support, and I promise you our ambassadors are always extremely vocal about that, including me. But when you talk about Hamas, it's something different, because they've actually been asked repeatedly to play the role that they are playing in Hamas, and I won't speak for them or for the Israeli government, but the coordination and how they do that support is quite close.
Ambassador Leaf, do you want to comment on this question, what you observed in some of the countries in which you served in terms of views of the region, but also where Israel fits into this?
So I always think it's important when we talk about the Arabs that we be very explicit about which state, which community of states we're talking about. So there's a tendency to talk, as I understand it, when people are talking about the peace plan, et cetera, and have been over the course of the last several years, there's a tendency to say the Arabs, meaning Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And I think those are very particular cases, and they're also, you know, a tiny drop in terms of population, and arguably in terms of sway of public opinion in a larger region, a region of about 410 million people. Emiratis, exactly 1 million or so. Saudi Arabia, 27 million. Now, I've had an opportunity to visit Saudi Arabia several times over the last couple of years, and the dynamic changes underway there are really quite extraordinary, and it's as if windows have been burst open, doors are open, and there's sunlight flooding into what was a very closed society. When I was there last year, I talked to a lot of private Saudis, across generations, and asked them how they viewed Israel, and got a mix of views. But in some cases, they were quite flipped. A 20-something staunchly told me, a young woman, that the Palestinian cause was near to the heart of Saudi youth. Whereas I talked to 40-something businessmen and women who said, you know, it's a country we admire, we have, you know, we have a great need for their technology, their know-how, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, you'd hear exactly the same thing in the UAE, where it's a very open society, it's a largely moderate, if traditional society. And so, in a sense, there's no surprise that the Emiratis have been leading the way in something short of normalization, but something that is increasingly public in terms of people-to-people contacts. But then, zoom back, and you've got big, pulsing communities like Iraq, 40 million, Algeria, 40 million. And I was in Iraq in September, and there, largely, Israel is not an issue except when there are unexpected explosions in militia arms depots, and then this gets whipped up by parts of the political class in an anti-Israel sort of screed. I just think it's very important that that we keep in mind that there are changes afoot, but it's a big region, and the changes are not in equal. They're not the similar dynamics within these societies, and not at the same pace.
It's a tricky thing, I think, from Israel's standpoint, because of course, I mean, to the extent that some of these regimes appear to be more open to encouraging ties, that's a welcome thing here, except that the footnote or the asterisk is always that the relationship between those leaders, those regimes, and the people, to the extent that relationship is sour or maybe is you know, that these regimes continue to be authoritarian. There is perhaps a risk always of a little bit of backfiring. But I want to actually bring that to a discussion of the publics in these countries. Can you comment on what you see? I mean, to what extent do the changes that you've seen at the level of elites or the level of political leaders, to what extent does that really reflect changes in terms of how Arab publics are thinking about Israel?
Okay, so if this had been 30 years ago, it would have had much more profound effects on the publics. And why? Because of technology, because of the way that people...
I just want to clarify, what would have had more?
The shift in the attitude of certain governments, certain elites, okay, in a neutral and then more positive direction towards Israel. So had it happened 30 years ago, when people consumed their news and got their information and were educated principally, if not exclusively, through government flows of information, their attitudes were almost wholly shaped by their governments, then you would see a top-down move that would be quite significant. But what's happened in the meantime in the last 10 years, 15 years, and this was touched on by a number of speakers yesterday, this profound flattening of the information landscape, really for the last 15 years, but at an accelerating pace in the last 10 years. When I went to Iraq in 2010 for a year, internet penetration was something like 5%. So Iraqis didn't have phones, they listened to the radio and read government newspapers for their information. And it was a real 1970s kind of attitude towards Israel, Palestine, and so on. Fast forward, and the internet penetration is 55% or so, but if you take the 65% of the population that is under 30, I am quite certain it's at the level of Saudi Arabia, where it's 90, 95%. So they are deluged with information. So the governments can't direct how they view things. They're now shaped by many other factors.
I was a spokesperson for most of my career, so I'm nostalgic for those days when we could just put out a press release from an embassy and put an ambassador on the channel and get our message out to a whole country. It changed while I was serving in Jordan. While I was serving in Jordan was when Al Jazeera was first created, and that obviously changed the landscape entirely in this region. I would say that in terms of publics, the Gulf was a real eye-opener for me. I hadn't had as much experience as Ambassador Leaf had when I went to Qatar. You know, I had been in Egypt and Jordan and Gaza and much closer to here. In the Gulf, what I found in Qatar was that young Qataris were very aware of their wealth, and they felt very lucky to have the wealth, and it made them feel like feel very empathetic to what they saw happening to Palestinians, mostly on Al Jazeera, because they felt like their life is so easy. And probably some guilt, you know, some like, oh, it's so hard for our cousins over there, and our life is so easy. So it is very emotional for young Qataris that I met, and certainly what they see on TV plays a large role in that.
You know, something to what Ambassador Leaf, you mentioned this explosion in information that's available to them, and they can go on the internet and get. So that may break down the ability of these regimes to be dictating what people should be knowing, if not thinking. But the flip side of that is that perhaps it actually opens other avenues of communication. I mean, we saw yesterday, we had a session here on some online polling that we did and communicating with people in the region through our Facebook site here, our Facebook page here at the Institute. So I do wonder if maybe the other side of this is potentially opening other avenues of communication with just average, regular Israelis like us at a think tank.
Absolutely, and you know, all of us now, I think, who are on social media are acutely aware of the degree to which these barriers have dissolved. But I go back to the thinking in the dawn of social media, when there was an assumption by governments in particular that social media would be an engine that governments would drive. They would use, and it would be used for the good. And it is used for good, and then plenty of people use it to disseminate truly awful stuff. So, and we saw that with ISIS. ISIS really weaponized social media unlike any other extremist group we'd ever seen. So yes, there is a good side, because Iraqis, Saudis can, with fascination, watch what's going on in Israel, even talk across cyberspace to Israelis. And there's a wholly different perspective permitted. But as I say, I'm very aware of how much the forces of extremism continue to shape thinking across social media.
So staying on the issue of the publics for a moment, I wonder more generally how you both assess the uptick in protests that we saw this last year across the region. Whether it was in Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, even Iran. Should we understand these protests as a kind of delayed Arab Spring 2.0, or is this something qualitatively different, maybe a harbinger of something to come in the next few years?
So, I mean, there are economic drivers, structural governance drivers to all of this, and you see it in all of these societies, including across the Arab-Persian divide. So, you know, the joke going around Iraq among activists and protesters when they started their protests October 1st, in Iran for totally different reasons, protests started in November, and Iraqis were congratulating themselves that Iran had spent 40 years exporting revolution. This time, Iraq was exporting it back into Iran. Yes and no. Frankly, the same drivers exist in Iran that exist across these others, which is huge youth bulge, unmet demands for governance, or unmet demands for services and employment, and sclerotic governance structures that just are unable to meet them. So if you take Iraq, you know, that population is growing at the highest rate of the region. So it's a country of 40 million that in 10 years' time will be 50 million. And almost 1 million job seekers are coming on the market every year. The government, as it stands, cannot manage. And so these protests are pretty open-ended despite really brutal repression by both government security forces and militias. They may eventually succeed, as the Iranians have periodically succeeded in repressing these protests, but they're bound to come back.
So since you mentioned Iraq, I just want to press on this for a moment and actually bring Lebanon into the picture too, because we've had a debate at the Institute about how much emphasis should we be putting on the anti-Iranian sentiment that seems to have emerged in some of these protests? If tomorrow the government in Iraq or the government in Lebanon decided to turn the lights back on, collect the trash, you know, give basic service provision, would people basically go home and the anti-Iranian, sort of anti-sectarianism that we've seen also recede into the background? Or is the anti-Iran element of this really much more central? How should we, and in Israel, for obvious reasons, we want to try and understand how much of that element really matters here. I
mean, so, you know, these militias that exist in Iraq, and there are several dozen of them. They are Qasem Soleimani's legacy, and it's a poisonous legacy. And whereas many of them were stood up on the battlefield to fight or to attack U.S. troops, they found new life and proliferated in the crisis, the national crisis of the fight against ISIS. Post-war, they have become predatory economic actors and armed actors. And they are part of the state while standing outside the state and not being responsive to the state. And whereas they were heroes of the fight against ISIS, they are now seen very much a part of the Iranian project. And they have been this tool for repressing the protests. And so they are really poison in the eyes of the Iraqi public. Now, that anti-Iranian dimension we saw a year ago in protests in the South. That has deepened precisely because of the role of these militias. But the crisis of governance and services and employment is such that that I think it's fair to say that there's a sort of deadlock. There's a power deadlock between the street and these militia sort of forces, which really control significantly the room for maneuver for the government. How Qasem Soleimani's removal from this space, and as importantly, the most powerful militia leader in Iraq, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, how that shapes internal dynamics of Iraq is very much an open question.
And I would just add that going beyond Iran and Iraq and Lebanon, the protests you saw in Algeria, Sudan, South America, I mean, it is the economic drivers that are the through line. And going back to the social media discussion, it's also people, you see young people in Algeria, young people in Sudan, understanding that there are other places in the world where people have a say in their leadership. The income disparity, the wealth gap plays a big role, and feeling like they should have a voice in bringing leaders who won't rob the country, I think has been a through line for a lot of these protests.
So I want to shift for a moment to a slightly more personal angle, if I could, and this is especially for Ambassador Smith. So I'm just curious, what is it like?
I am married.
Yeah, right. What is it like being a Jewish woman serving in Qatar?
It was a lot like being any other kind of woman in Qatar. Yeah, it was fun. I was the 4th woman to be ambassador in Qatar, so I was not a trailblazer in that respect, but I was the first Jewish woman to be ambassador there. I think the first Jewish ambassador there. And definitely the youngest. And you know, my feeling when I went into the job was a lot like my feeling when I went into all my other jobs was I am there as the United States of America, not as Dana Shell Smith. And so I chose not to really talk about it. I didn't address it. You know, religion, my personal religion didn't come into my work and my conversations. Although everywhere I've served, the Jewish community has found me, and I've always hosted all of the holidays. So I guess if somebody wanted to figure it out, they could. And in my 3rd year, I think I told you this the other day and promised I would repeat it, I did decide I was curious to see how Qataris would react if I did tell them, and I felt comfortable at that point that I was certainly safe, and you know, I felt good about my position there. So the first person I told was the emir. And we were sitting one day talking, and I said, "Did you know that I'm Jewish?" And he looked at me and he said, "How would I not know?" And then he followed up by saying, "And why would you think it would matter?" Which was very telling to me. You know, I didn't go up and say it to random people on the street, and so I can't be certain every single Qatari would react the same way. I'm quite sure not all of them would, but all of the people who knew it was, you know, people asked if they could come to my Seder.
Ambassador Leaf, I'll ask a variant on the theme. I'm just curious, because I think for a while there was a perception that being a woman diplomat in the Middle East would perhaps carry its own set of challenges, shall we say. Did you find that at all in your time serving?
Literally never. I sometimes found it an impediment within the State Department, but no, in all seriousness, no. This was quite a revelation to me. Coming out of the 2-year Arabic program, spent a year in Tunis for the 2nd year and then went to Cairo. very junior diplomat, but we had an extraordinary number of very high-level visitors, including Vice President Gore, President Clinton on the way to Jordan for the signing of the peace treaty. And I was invariably pulled into handling a set of responsibilities that had me working very closely with 3- and 4-star Egyptian generals, security chiefs, and so forth. And I spoke Arabic, and the fact that I was a woman was sort of was tantalizing to them. Was, you know, I was a strange object of almost fascination, perhaps because I was American and I was, you know, I spoke Arabic, but I was essentially treated there as a third sex. I was treated in terms of my title as an American official, and I certainly found that that was the case in spades in even a very traditional society like the UAE. It was my position, not my gender. And actually it was a huge advantage because I had access to both sides of society, which in the Gulf societies, all of them to a certain degree have a degree of separation of genders. It's not visible in UAE society largely because you see women, Emirati women in every domain. But in terms of social life and so forth, I had access, absolute access to both sides. So it was an advantage.
Can I just add on to that? I had the exact same experience. And I even found that after I had been with the women in a minister's home, the minister treated me very differently the next time I saw him, you know, because now I'm sort of like family, because the only women that will be in the home that he would be family, and I've seen his wife uncovered, and I know his daughters, and suddenly saying no to me is going to be much more difficult.
Harder.
So it was an advantage, and fun, because by the way, fashion is big business, and when we're doing trade promotion, it's really fun promoting fashion.
So in the few remaining minutes we have, I want to bring it back to a question of US policy as it relates to the region, but also in terms of trying to bring the region closer to Israel. The United States is going to be, it's already to some extent in campaign mode, but in the coming year. Let's suppose a scenario where you are each asked to come in and you have a few minutes to advise the incoming president. What are some key lines of policy that you would suggest the incoming president consider when it comes to trying to bring Israel closer together with the Arab states more generally?
Okay, so I don't think, you know, I don't like this dichotomy or this sort of binary choice of sort of outside in, or, well, I'm not even sure what the other, you know, only through the gate of Palestinian agreement to a negotiated settlement and then at some later point normalization. I think you can find something along the spectrum. What I do think is lacking right now is sufficient groundwork done. You mentioned that it was, and everybody realizes this, of course, that it was a highly, highly secret process, and it wasn't a negotiation. It was something that was presented for people to admire, to reject, or maybe just to walk away from. It's not really clear to me. So what's the spark, you know, to the engine that gets things moving? I do think there is a role for a number of Arab states in the region to assist, but it's got to be a very collaborative approach that really draws in people across some pretty sharp cleavages, and it's not only in the Gulf that there are those sharp cleavages. So the U.S. has got to take a very hands-on coaching role while spurring the parties to begin discussions, and really there's nothing that prevents, well, there are a lot of things that prevent, but to the degree Israelis and Palestinians begin to find some channels for conversation, back channels, what are they, whatever. This can be an accelerant or accelerated by an administration who comes in, but right now I feel it's a sort of a one-dimensional approach.
And I know we don't have a lot of time, so I would just say I would advise our next president to be clear about the American role in the region. Because all of the wishy-washy, we're in, we're out, we're leaving, we're staying, we care about this, we don't care about that, has everyone back on their feet and getting close to other countries that don't have the same capacity and the same interests that we have, in my opinion. So I would advise the president to take a very strong approach, that we have interests in the region. Israel, strong Israel is one of them, and to act like we mean it, and put our money where our mouth is, and make it a priority.
Ambassador Smith, Ambassador Leaf, thank you so much for your insights and for being here. Thank you all for being here.